My guest on the program today is Nona Jones. One of her many roles, aside from being wife and mummy and pastor and author, is the head of global faith-based partnerships at Facebook. Hello, Nona. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So the show is all about story. And I would like to go back to a time in your life where you were the troublemaker at school. You were the kind of the delinquent, if you like. And in fact, at school, you struggled academically. And they kind of really sidelined you, but nobody ever asked you why. So today I thought I'd ask you why. Why were you the troublemaker at school?
Thank you for asking that question. I was born to a mother who actually didn't want to have children. She was married to my father for about 15 years when she found out that she was pregnant with me. She grew up in a home that was defined by violence. Her father was very, very abusive to her mother. She had 11 brothers and sisters. They lived in a 2-room house. And so I think at an early age, she just decided she did not want that dysfunction. And so when she found out she was pregnant with me, she was actually angry. But my father was elated because he wanted to have a child. He had wanted to have a child since they first got married. But about 6 months into the pregnancy, he started to have some stomach cramps. And so he went to the doctor just to see what was going on, and he ended up getting diagnosed with terminal stomach cancer. He was given 6 months to live, but he actually lived until about 2 months shy of my 2nd birthday, which his greatest fear was that I wouldn't remember him. But I remember him through the images, because when he found out that he was dying, he literally started an Olympic sprint of memory making with me. So I have all these pictures of him with him. But my mother did not want to be a mom. And so shortly after he died, she moved us to Florida. And she was following after a man who she barely knew, but he promised that he would take care of her and take care of me. And that relationship ended shortly thereafter. But when I was around 4, she met a guy who became her live-in boyfriend. And it wasn't too long into that relationship that he started to show signs that made me feel unsafe. He would hug me too tight when she wasn't around, and he wouldn't let me go. At the same time, my mother started to become physically abusive. And so when I started kindergarten, I was in a situation where I didn't feel safe. My mother's boyfriend had started to touch me inappropriately when she was not around. And between that and I think the physical abuse, it just created a level of dysfunction within myself that really manifested as that type of behavior that made teachers label me as a problem child. And when I was around 5.5 years old, my mother went up north to attend her sister's funeral, and she left me at home with him. And I begged her not to leave me because I didn't feel safe around him, but she said she couldn't afford another plane ticket. And so that very night, I locked my bedroom door because I thought that that would keep me safe, but he used a straight and wire hanger to pick the lock. And that was the first time that he violated me sexually at the age of about 5.5. And I think between all the chaos that was happening before that time and then having to experience that, my behavior literally deteriorated because I was experiencing so much chaos at home. And so I was acting out at school, and I was angry. I was tired because I wasn't able to sleep because I was afraid he was going to come back in the room. And he did continue to violate me. And I think, teachers, they just saw my behavior and they just assumed that I was a bad kid, that I just had problems and I was just angry. What no one ever asked was, hey, what happened to you to make you behave this way? So it was a very volatile situation, and I was routinely violated over the course of 7 years. And when my mother found out about it, because I was about 7, and I finally told her what he did, she did have him arrested. And I was so grateful that he was out of the house. But then on the day of his release, she took me with her to pick him up from jail and brought him back to the house, where he continued to do it again. And so my childhood was very, very, very volatile, very, very rocky. And I think being a mother myself now, I could not imagine knowing that someone hurt my child like that and then bringing them back into their life. And so my behavior literally just continued to deteriorate because I could not focus. I would explode at school. I would implode at home. I became very quiet at home because I literally felt like I had no sense of safety, like nobody cared about me. And it was a very, very, very difficult time. I did not grow up in a Christian home. So we did not talk about Jesus, the Bible. We didn't go to church. I had no sense of stability. And so at the age of 9, I tried to take my life. And I have a 9-year-old son right now, and I look at him all the time and I think, oh my gosh, I couldn't imagine, him trying to take his life. But that's where I was, and it wasn't successful. So I tried again when I was 11. And it was shortly after that I actually got invited to go to church. But I tried to take my life twice before that day arrived.
Wow. You did have one teacher who noticed you. She didn't ask you why you were playing up, but she saw something in you. Tell us a bit about, is it Miss Johnson?
Miss Johnson, she was my 4th grade teacher, and she noticed my behavior, and she was the only teacher that actually stopped me one day and said, Nona, you're smart. She was like, you're better than this. And even though she didn't ask me why I was behaving that way, the fact that she actually saw me, it just did something to me. It made me think, well, maybe I am smart, because for this period of time, I was told I had a learning disability. I mean, teachers told my mother, back then it was called retardation. They said, oh, she's mentally retarded. And my mom had the school administer a learning aptitude test, and I actually tested gifted. So it wasn't that I had a learning disability, it was what was happening to me. But Miss Johnson, she literally said, look, I see what you're doing. She was like, but you're capable of so much more. And she became kind of the light in a very, very, very dark tunnel of my childhood. And
it was because of her that you really started working hard and you wanted to live up to her expectations.
I did.
You excelled.
Yeah, I did. She spoke into my potential, and I think that's so important. I have a background working with children who are challenged, whether it's educationally, intellectually, psychologically, and so many of them are just yearning for somebody to say, there's potential in you, and that oftentimes gets overlooked, unfortunately.
So age 11, a buddy of yours, a friend of yours, invites you to church, and you kind of think, it's a play date, right?
Right. Yeah, I had never heard of church before, and so she was a good friend of mine, and so I'm thinking we're gonna go over her house and play. I don't know, is this a game? But yeah, she invited me to go to church, and I said to her, I was like, what's that? And she laughed because she thought I was joking. She was like, how do you not know what church is? But I didn't. And so she invites me to go, and I asked my mom. My mom said, sure, because I guess that got me out of the house. And so she said, sure. And so we pull up to this building, and there's all these families getting out of their cars, and they're holding hands, and they're smiling at each other. And, my only experience of a so-called family was just anger and dysfunction and just fighting all the time. And so I was amazed. Just in the parking lot, I was already amazed. And then we walked up to the church, and there was a couple ladies standing at the door, and they didn't even know me. And they were like, hey, beautiful, how are you? And they were just so kind. I was like, what is this place? And then I walked inside, and more people were greeting me. And it's amazing as I reflect now, leading a church myself, it's like, you just don't know what people are carrying when they walk through those doors. I mean, those people had no idea. I was a survivor of 2 suicide attempts, that I was living in a state of sexual and physical abuse. They had no idea.
This is age 11.
Yeah, at age 11, but they loved me, and they saw me, and they affirmed me. And that was my first encounter with church. And I'll never forget the very first sermon I ever heard preached. The pastor said, God is a father to the fatherless. And I remember hearing that, and I was like, well, who is this God? Because I had cried so many nights, wishing my father was still alive. Because I felt like if my father had been alive, then I wouldn't have experienced what I experienced. And so I would literally cry out, Daddy, why did you leave me? Daddy, I need you. And to hear that God was a father to the fatherless, it was like he spoke to me directly, because that's exactly what I needed to hear. And I asked my friend's mother, I said, can I take one of these books home? It was the Bible, but I didn't know. I just like, this guy was preaching out of this book. So I said, can I take one of these books home? And she let me, and I think it's Psalm 68. And I just read it over and over and over again, okay, I need to know who this God is. And then I went back to the first Psalm, and I started to read through the Psalms, and I was like, okay, what are all these other books in here? And they looked like people's names. And so I was just like, okay, what is this? And it was hard for me to understand, because I think it was a King James version. So it was like the these and the thou shalts and all this. And I was like, what is this? But I got a new translation that was easier to read. And at that age, at the age of 11, I started to read the Bible for myself. I mean, I didn't have anybody at home to help interpret anything. So I just read it for myself, and I felt like God was speaking to me out of this book. It was incredible.
Amazing. Things didn't change physically for you or in your home, but something had changed on the inside for you.
Absolutely. I remember reading that, I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. And that was like a turning point in my mind, because up until then, I thought I was unworthy. I thought I was unlovable. When I tried to take my life, it was because I literally felt like I had no purpose, like I had no worth, I had no value. And then reading that God created me, and He created me fearfully, meaning with actual precision, meaning that He created me with reverence, and that I was wonderfully made, like that just blew my mind. I was like, there is a God that created me. And before I was even formed in my mother's womb, He knew who I was and He called me. I was like, okay, well, there's more to this life than just going home and being angry all the time. And so I think that really became the turning point, is beginning to understand my identity in God. It superseded all the things that my mother had said about me. It superseded all the things her boyfriend had done to me. There was something bigger and God had something bigger in store for me than just my past. And I think that became really the change in my story.
And so you begin to pursue Him, and you begin to do really well at school, and you become really successful in business, as an entrepreneur, as a young businesswoman, full of hope and really successful with Jesus at the center of all that you are. And you do end up beginning to work with young girls who have been marginalized by society, who are pretty broken, those who have journeyed through awful trauma. And you find yourself in a job that you absolutely love. So tell us a little bit about this, because there was a time that then God told you to lay that down and to resign.
So Miss Johnson in the 4th grade, she planted that seed in me that said I was capable of more. But what happened was in the 5th grade, the teacher right after that, she actually pulled me out of line. We were heading to art class one day. I remember it like it was yesterday. She pulled me out of line and she put her finger in my face and she said, "You will never be successful. All you will ever be is a failure." Like she was just upset with me because I think I was acting out or something. And that broke my heart. Like it broke my heart. And it was actually shortly after that, after she did that, that was the second time I tried to take my life, because I went from this seed of you have the capacity for greatness to you will always be a failure. And so it literally broke me. But the very next year in 6th grade, in the middle of 6th grade, my teachers got together and they said, "Nona, you know what, you are smart, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to promote you to advanced classes." This was in the middle of the 6th grade. Okay. So I did that, began to do really well in school, made good grades. As you said, I graduated successfully. I went on to college, got this, great scholarship. Everything was looking great. Everything was looking bright. Started out a year after I graduated in an executive role for a Fortune 100 company. I mean, I'm literally sitting at this boardroom with people who could have been my parents. And so it was incredible. I was not qualified for that job at all. God just made it happen. Then I moved from there into a municipal utility where I was handling like federal policy and state policy work, community affairs and community engagement. And I went from there to this statewide network of alternative schools for girls, which I thought I would be in that role forever. I mean, it was quite literally like my heart's calling, my mission, working with these girls who had been broken, who had gone through abuse, who had gone through neglect. I was 4 years into the role, and I thought I would be doing it another 20 when the culture of the executive team started to become a bit unhealthy. And I was praying about it one day. I was like, well, Lord, what should I do in this situation? Because it was just so strange and unexpected. And the Lord told me to resign. The Lord basically said in 4 words, "This assignment is over." That's specifically what God said. And I thought I heard it incorrectly because I was like, I love what I'm doing. I cannot imagine doing anything differently. So I prayed a couple of days later and the Lord said again, "This assignment is over." Like He never changed what He said. And I was just like, okay. I was like, well, Lord, if this assignment is over, then what's next? The only thing God said is resign at the end of the fiscal year, which was June 30th, 2017. So basically that gave me like 2.5 months to prepare to leave the job that I thought I would have for another 20 years.
What did your husband think of this?
Well, so he basically, and my husband's a pastor. He's a man of great faith. He was like, "What are you doing?" He was like, "What do you mean?
How are we going to pay the bills, honey?"
Yeah, basically. He was like, "Okay, if you're resigning, are these bills resigning? Because we still have kids in private school. We have a mortgage. We have cars." But he said, if this is God's will, he will provide. And so we just kind of rested in that. And it was like, okay. So, that was April. We get to June 30th. We fast forward to June 30th. In between that time, I had written several iterations of my letter of resignation because I kept going back and forth. I remember actually praying. I was like, Lord, if there's any other way, I don't want to leave my job. So, but God was steadfast. So I get to that day. I'm sitting across from my boss. We meet at 1:00 p.m. and it was a Friday. We happened to be at a conference together, which was so bizarre because, in my mind, I was going to resign at the office. We ended up being at this leadership conference together, which I'm like, who resigns at a leadership conference? So we're sitting across from each other. I hand her my letter of resignation. I tell her why I'm leaving. And she's like, well, what are you going to do? Like, is there anything I can do to change your mind? I'm like, no. And she's like, well, what are you going to do? I have to tell people. I was like, I'll tell you soon. That's all I could say. And so we finished talking around 1:40. And I get in the car and I'm with my husband. We're together. We're driving home. And at 2:05, my cell phone rings. And it's a 650 area code, San Francisco, California. I don't get calls from San Francisco. So I'm thinking it's a telemarketer. But I answer the phone. This lady's like, oh, is this Nona Jones? And I said, yes. So she proceeds to tell me she worked for Facebook. And I'm like, who calls from Facebook? I've never gotten a call from Facebook. But she tells me that apparently the week before I resigned, Mark changed the mission of the whole company to focus on community building. Apparently it was like huge news that I completely missed. Even though I was using Facebook at the time, I completely missed it. And she told me, she said that he had some research done to try to understand what are all the different types of communities that exist. And there was parenting, there was fitness, there was all these types of communities. But she said that he found out that the largest community that was the most meaningful to the people who were in them were communities of faith. And he was shocked by that because he at one point was atheist, then he became agnostic. And so he's kind of been moving along the continuum of faith. And so he was like, we've never focused on this as a company. Like, we need somebody to do this. And one of my friends, I was in a leadership program with him. He was sitting at the table with him when he says this. And he goes, I think I know the perfect person to do this, but I don't think we could get her to leave her job because she loves what she's doing. And so he's talking about me not realizing that God had told me like 2 months before this to resign. And so she called me 25 minutes after I resigned, the day God told me to resign. He specifically told me that day. She calls me just out of the blue. And it just is a testament to the faithfulness of God and how God will meet our faith at our level of obedience.
Wow. So for the last, 2.5 years, you've been working with Facebook.
Yeah.
Tell us just a little bit about what your role involves,
Sure.
just day to day.
So, every day is completely different, I will tell you, but I work with faith leaders, faith institutions to help them use Facebook in a new way, because I think most organizations typically use Facebook as like a content distribution channel. It's basically just used for marketing, but because the focus is on community building, for those of us in the faith, for those of us who do ministry, it really has the potential to help us do discipleship digitally. And if you think about it, discipleship is all about relationship. And so for me, it's really about helping these organizations shift away from using social media as a broadcast platform and really trying to get them to use social media as a ministry platform. Whereas broadcast is unidirectional, right? So people listening to this or watching could say, oh, I saw that passively. But a relational distribution channel is about building connections between and among people. And that's what ministry is all about. So that's what I do, is I help these organizations and these leaders just reimagine what Facebook is capable of as a social ministry channel.
So what were you doing before you got this role that tweaked the interest of this friend of yours that made him say, look, you've you've got to get this girl on board?
So he knew I was in ministry. So he knew that, I'm a preacher, my husband and I have a church. So he just figured that because I had that ministry lens, that I would then be able to overlay that with kind of the technical lens of Facebook.
Well, and you've got a Facebook page, so surely you're the right person.
Right. Like, oh my gosh, what qualifies you to lead global faith-based partners? I have a Facebook account. So that qualifies me. Yeah. I literally believe it was just God. Like I meet people all the time, and I say this openly. I meet people all the time who are way more qualified than I am. I mean, they've built digital strategies for some of the largest organizations in the world. And so it's not at all my technical training or preparation that has placed me here. It is nothing but the grace and favor of God. Simple, plain and simple. I never filled out an application. It was 2 weeks from the time I got the first call to the time I had my offer letter. And they even had to ask me to send my resume to them because they didn't have it and they didn't know what address to put on the offer letter. Like, it's literally one of those situations where it is nothing but God. That's how I ended up where I am.
How do you see social media and Facebook in particular how do you enable us as the church to engage proactively and in a really positive way? Because sometimes it can become something that's really negative and something that becomes all-consuming. So if you are challenging churches in particular and Christian ministries to be more proactive and more engaging with community, what kind of message are you putting out there? How are you equipping the church to do that in a positive way?
A couple things I would say. One is, I think where we get into trouble is when we use these platforms as a megaphone to really spew knowledge at people. We'll say, the Bible says this and scripture says that. And the problem is when you're in a situation like that, where you don't really have relationships with people, all that does is it disintegrates into arguments. So what I always advise people is, remember, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. You have to first look for opportunities to minister to people's needs, to encourage people, and then that gives you the right and it gives you the privilege of ministering to people scripturally. But you don't want to lead with that, because I think the Bible is our best example of this. I mean, Jesus told all the disciples, he said, they will know that you are Christians by your love for one another, but as well for the world. And the question is, how are we showing up in digital environments? I've seen so many Christians who damage not only their witness, but the witness of Jesus by being condemning in these platforms, because we come across as, well, this is what the Bible says, but how do we live our life? A lot of people are hurting on social media. I know of examples of churches I've worked with that have created Facebook groups as an online campus for their church, where people have said in those groups, I'm thinking about taking my life. Or please pray for my friend who just overdosed on drugs. I mean, people are hurting. And so I think what we have to do is we have to get into a mindset that says, these are channels that enable us to minister to people's needs, not just to spew theology or doctrine at them, because that's not what people need immediately. They need to know you care. So using it as a platform to communicate caring, and then speaking the word of God, because that is our source of truth. But it's just like, none of us like for somebody to come at us and say we're wrong. But what they do like, and I'm a testament to that, is to say, how can I help you? How can I pray for you? How can I support you? Because this is what the Bible says. I've gone from that kind of, how can I help you? How can I pray for you? How can I support you? To this is what the Bible says over time with people, that has created discipleship. And I think that's really the goal. That's the goal.
Have you experimented with your own church?
Yes. So
How's it going?
It's going very well. So at our church, we use Facebook groups as our online campus. And so something my husband and I will do periodically that goes really, really well is the Monday night after we have service on Sunday, we'll go live in the group and we'll just talk about whatever the message was from the previous day and just answer questions. And we have found that when we do that, we get so much engagement in the group, so many questions, people feeling like, oh my gosh, you're in your home and we're kind of in your home with you. It's using that tool to just lower the barrier to access. And that's really what social media is about. It's about lowering the barriers to access to each other. But it's going so well. About 40% of our group doesn't even go to our church. And that is amazing to
Wow.
me. The Bible says that we are to be fishers of men. Jesus said, come follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. But I think that we have actually really become keepers of the aquarium. Like, we're so used to just seeing the same fish swimming around the fishbowl. But what social media allows you to do is it allows you to actually fish in uncharted waters. So 40% of the people in our group don't go to our church, don't even live in our state, but they're part of our community.
It is hard to break away from that traditional mindset of me being able to see as a minister the congregation every Sunday.
Yeah.
And not get disheartened when I don't see the same people that I expect to see there every week. And that I sometimes would forget then that I've actually got maybe a whole other congregation watching on Facebook Live, for instance, or whatever. It's quite difficult. What has the response been from a lot of the faith-based communities and churches?
So I would say two things to that. So the first thing is, especially in the United States, 3 out of 4 people, that's like 75% of the population, is on Facebook. Many pastors, they kind of push back on streaming or having Facebook groups because in their mind, they're like, oh, people aren't going to come to the building. But if you knew that 75% of your community was congregated in one place, wouldn't you have a location there? That's the question I always ask them. And universally, the answer is, of course I would. So I say it's the exact same thing with Facebook. I mean, 75% of any given community is going to be on Facebook. So we need to have a presence there. So typically the pushback is, oh, they won't come to the building. But then I also ask them, okay, well, if you're not using it now, how is your attendance now? And they're like, it's not good. So I'm like, the reality is by using these platforms to build relationships with people, you're actually giving yourself another avenue for growth. It's not necessarily going to lead to decline. It'll lead to growth. Like we see now, there have been people who have come to our church because they were in our group and they made relationships in the group. And now they're like, oh, I want to come see what this church is about. So that's one of the first things I would say. And I think the second thing is I think people have to understand that these channels actually broaden our reach. They broaden our reach. I mean, the Great Commission was for us to reach all the nations and teach them to obey what Jesus commanded. Well, you can't teach anybody anything unless you're first reaching them. And right now, there's almost 3 billion people on Facebook alone. So think about missions, right? We say, well, I'm going to go do a missions trip. That requires raising thousands of dollars, taking time off of work, and traveling to a foreign country. What if you can reach people in that country and you can send resources to people in that country without having to leave? I mean, you have organizations in that country that are declaring the gospel that would love to have the resources. I mean, it's enabling us to do ministry in a new way.
Have you met Mark?
I have, yes.
What's he like?
So Mark is a computer programmer at his core. So he is the CEO of this huge company, but you have to remember, he started it as a dorm project. When he was at Harvard, he started it as something in his dorm to connect people to each other. He never envisioned that it would gather a third of the Earth's population in one place, right? So in his mind, he's always thinking about how do I make this platform better? But he is not a talker. He is not the person that you're probably going to have give the commencement address and be like super exciting. But he's a really good person, good heart, and I think he wants to do the right thing in the world.
So the fact that you're still there after 2.5 years means that it's working, that what you're doing is working?
I hope it's working. I mean, I love what I'm doing. I feel like there's so much more that we can do. And, every other week I'm hearing about a new product that we've created or a new tool that we've created that I didn't even know we were working on. And the thing that I always ask myself is, okay, how can we use this for ministry? So one of the products that we have, or one of the companies we have, is Oculus. So that's our virtual reality hardware and software. One of my friends, he pastors what's called VR church. Virtual reality church. It uses the Oculus headsets and it actually creates an immersive church experience in virtual reality. I'm always thinking, how do we use these tools to build the kingdom? So there's so much more that can be done.
Wow, wow. What have you found most surprising about working at Facebook?
Most surprising? Well, I will tell you, it's not something I found surprising, but it is something I found helpful. Is one of our philosophies is that we should have deep convictions that are loosely held. And by that, it means we should feel very passionate about the things that we do, but we should also not be married to it because it could be wrong. So there have been products, for example, that we've invested a lot of time and a lot of money in that it wasn't heading in the right direction, and we'll just scrap it and move on. Now, to me, I'm like, we just invested millions and like months and years into this, and we're just scrapping it. But that's part of the philosophy of the company. And so I've actually adopted that myself, is, you know what? If something's not working, let's not continue to invest in it just because we've already invested so much. If it's not working, let's just move on. And that's really helped me, even in ministry. You know, I think a lot of times in churches, we kind of have these sacred cows, right? Like we have these things that we've been doing forever. It isn't really yielding fruit, but we've been doing it forever, so we'll just keep doing it. I think working at Facebook has really taught me, like, look, if it's not working, just move on and find something else that will work, because lives are truly at stake.
In terms of your work with ministries and churches, is there something that really excites you? What is it that, you know, when you're speaking to these communities and church pastors and ministry leaders?
I think the thing that excites me the most is I believe that right now we are in the midst of another reformation. I think that at first there was trepidation about radio, right? It was like, oh God, radio is going to usher in the devil, right? And then television happened. It was like, oh God, television is going to usher in the devil. And then we realized, oh wait, these are tools that can actually expand the gospel message. And I think right now we're realizing that digital technology, especially social technology, can allow us to scale the good news of Jesus Christ faster and further than we've ever been able to even imagine, instantaneously. And so I'm excited because I see so many leaders that are catching on to that. When I first started, I think people were just truly afraid. They were like, no, I don't want to use that because people will stop coming to church. What we call church is really a building. But the life of Jesus, I think, is probably the best indicator of what church is. Jesus never put his name on a building. He never said, hey, I have this great parable that I want to share. Come see me at the temple this weekend, right? Jesus was the living, walking, talking embodiment of the good news because he was the church everywhere that he went. And I think we're in the midst of a reformation now where we have all these leaders who now see that the church is not a building. It's a community of people who are united under the lordship of Jesus Christ. That's what excites me, because that's what my job is all about. And I believe that's what God has called me to do, is to really help shift the paradigm about what church even is. If we think church is what happens at a place on a date at a time, then we've basically constrained our ability to minister to people to who shows up in the building. But man, there's 168 hours in a week where we have the capacity to reach people wherever they are.
She is head of global faith-based partnerships at Facebook. My guest today is Nona Jones. Quick few other questions about your fitness. When did you realize that this was something you needed to be a whole lot more intentional about? You started running, you lost 100 pounds and you've kept it off. Why did that become important to you?
Wow. You know, this is the first time someone, and I've done a lot of interviews, this is the first time someone has asked me about this, and I'm actually really glad that you did. So I was overweight, like really almost all of my life. I think especially growing up with the trauma, food really became my medicine. And so I ate and ate and ate and ate to medicate the pain. So I was always really overweight. And when I got in college, I actually lost weight because I was walking all over campus and I wasn't eating as much. But then after I got married, I started gaining the weight back again. When I had my first son, gained weight. When I had my second son, gained weight. And after I had my second son, I was on bed rest for like the majority of the pregnancy. I felt so bad. Like I just felt unhealthy. I felt like when I breathed, I just didn't feel good. And I got on the scale and I was about 276 pounds after I had my child. This was after. Okay, so the baby's out. You know, like I can't say, oh, look at the baby weight. No, the baby was out. I was about 276 pounds. And I think I was doing a leadership program, and we went to Disney World for one of our program days. And somebody in the class said, oh, you know, they have a half marathon here at Disney every year called the Princess Half. And women come and men come and they all run it and they'll wear tutus and all this stuff. And I was like, oh, I want to do that. mind you, I was not a runner. Like the furthest I had run was like maybe 5 feet and I was winded. So I was like, oh, I'm gonna do that. So I signed up for it and I decided I was gonna train for this half marathon. I don't know what got into me, but I knew I just wanted something different. Like I always admired runners. When I would drive down the street and I would just see somebody running randomly, I was like, how do people just run? I just couldn't understand. So trained for about 8 months. And I remember talking to a friend of mine who had started running and she was like, oh, well, you won't lose weight. She said, just don't worry about that. She said, but you will get in shape. I was like, no, if I'm gonna run a half marathon, I'm gonna lose weight. So I eliminated anything from my diet that was, fatty, sugary, fried food, all of that. Started to really focus on, fresh fruits and vegetables, lean meats, drank nothing but water. And by the time I was ready to run the half marathon, I had already lost 60 pounds. And so I was so excited. My goal was just to run it straight through. I figured I'd run it slow. And I was like, this is gonna be the first and last time I run. Finished the race, running through the finish line. I felt so amazing. I was tired and in pain, but I felt so amazing that when I got back to my hotel that day, I signed up for another race. And literally had been running since then. Lost, like you said, 100 pounds. Have kept it off for over 7 years now because fitness has become a part of my life. It's not something that I do. It's literally my lifestyle. And the reason is I just wanted to feel good about myself. Like I wanted to be able to breathe without feeling bad all the time. And so that's why I do it. And so now I work out many days, twice a day. It's just part of my life. I don't drink coffee, I run.
How do you fit that in where you're traveling around the world? And
it's part of my daily schedule. So I run Monday, Wednesday, Friday mornings. Well, I work out every weekday morning, usually around 7. So I'll either run 5 miles outside or I'll do 45 minutes on the elliptical Tuesday and Thursday. And then in the afternoons, I always work out again. I'll do like my muscle training regimen, but it's on my calendar. So it's blocked on my calendar. So nothing else can get scheduled then. That was a trick I learned early on is if you don't schedule the time, something will always take its place. Something will happen. And so I'll move that calendar block. Like let's say I have to have a meeting during the time I would normally do my afternoon workout. Well, I'll maybe do it over lunch, but I just make sure that I get it done because the reality is I just don't want to go back to where I was. I just remember feeling unhealthy. I remember what that was like. And I just don't want to go back. So that's how.
Your book, your memoir, comes out in the UK in February 2020.
Yes.
And although it's only released then, we can order it now on pre-order.
Yes.
Success from the Inside Out.
Yeah.
In my assumption of this book, although you'd given your life to Jesus as a young girl, and you'd attained an incredible amount of success really quickly for a young woman, success that nobody ever expected of you. Mm-hmm. The trauma that you suffered kept pulling you back, and it was only when you allowed yourself to take that trauma to the feet of Jesus and let him heal you that you truly began to heal from the inside out.
Yeah.
Is that kind of a little bit about what it's about?
Yeah, no, you captured it perfectly. I talk about many things in the book, but my main message is that, there is always a pain in our hearts. There's always something in our hearts that is something we regret. It's something that we really wish never happened. Whether it's something that happened to us or something we did, there's always something in our heart that we look to as a way of defining our worth. We look at, oh my gosh, I wish I, didn't get divorced, or I wish I didn't go to jail, or I wish I wasn't, raped. We look at those things and we say, I wish that didn't happen. And as a result, we see ourselves as less than, because we're constantly evaluating our present with our past. So what I'm trying to do in this book is use my life as a case study in, number one, you can have all the trappings of success and be trapped in your success, because you're looking at your past as an indicator of whether or not you're worthy. And my hope is that through my story, through what I share about my faith journey, that people will see themselves. And I mean, the big secret, and you can read the book, but the big secret is forgiveness. Really, truly understanding the power that God gives us to forgive those who hurt us, because that's where the redemption power lies, is when we can say, you know what? What happened to me was horrible. What I did should not have ever happened, but I don't have to be defined by those things. And therefore, there are areas of my life where I need to release offenders so that I can actually get on with the future of my life. I have discovered that there's really two ways to be successful. You can be successful by either running toward your future, or you can be successful by running from your past. And the way that you are looking determines it. For me, I had a lot of toxic ambition. I mean, I was successful in the sense that I had the positions and my resume was all long and all that, but it wasn't filling. There's a success that you can have that is both filling, or a success you can have that is emptying. And I think it's in Joshua 1:8 where God says that if we observe to do all that he has commanded, we will make our own way prosperous and we will have good success. I believe there's a reason why that word good is there, because you can have a success that isn't good. It's a success that I look at people like, Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade and people in the States who have taken their own lives at the height of their success. It doesn't mean that just because you have everything that you have something to live for. So I'm trying to use this book to really show people what they have to live for. And it's not the material possessions. It is who God has created you to be. And God has created you to turn your pain into purpose.
So I gather you forgave your mum and her partner?
Yeah, had to. Yeah. The thing about it, though, is many people ask, well, what's your relationship like with your mom now? We don't really have a relationship. And the reason for that is relationships are mutual. So just because you forgive somebody doesn't necessarily mean that they're healthy enough to be in your life. And that's something else I had to learn, is that you can love somebody without always having to be attached to that person. But I had to forgive, and I had to realize hurt people hurt people. My mom, she had been hurt. Her ex-boyfriend had been hurt. And so what they did, if I was to ask them why, they wouldn't be able to tell me. But hurt creates hurt in other people. So I had to release it because I don't want to perpetuate that in my own family.
Nona Jones, my guest on the show today. Thank you for telling your story.
Thank you so much.